welcome to the Cell Energy Lecture over photosynthesis. First, what is energy? Energy is necessary in order to sustain life. And energy is the ability to do work. So we're able to do work and able to sustain life by doing the work in our cells. Cell energy is then needed for a variety of things like active transport, making proteins, nucleic acids, having chemical signals in our body. So there's a lot of different reasons why our cells need to create and use the energy. So what types of energy are there? There's a variety of types. We're just going to mention a few here. The first is light energy or radiant energy from the sun. We're going to use radiant a lot in this unit. So radiant energy is energy that comes from the sun. So when the sun shines down and the producers make their own food from that sunlight energy, that's the radiant energy. Then there's chemical energy, like glucose or ATP that we talked about in our last unit. When those plants create that glucose from photosynthesis, that glucose is now a chemical energy and no longer a radiant energy. And the last one we're going to talk about is thermal or heat energy, which we can release in cellular respiration. Now, before we get into how the energy is created, we want to talk about a couple of different organisms that and how they get their energy. So we can classify organisms based on how they receive energy. The first is autotrophs, and they use sunlight to make their own food. So they create their own food. They don't have to physically eat in order to get energy. And so there are plants and some microorganisms like bacteria and protists that have the ability to make their own energy through the process of photosynthesis. And then there are heterotrophs. And these get energy from the foods that they eat. So they have to physically eat something and digest and metabolize that in order to get energy from that food. Things that do this are like animals, fungi, and most microorganisms. So living things use chemical energy in our cells. So the majority of our cell energy is used in a chemical form. So when we're talking about these, our cells aren't using radiant energy, they're using chemical energy. And that energy is in the form of ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, which is a chemical compound that is found in cells and is stored in your cells to release energy when it's needed. ATP is made in the mitochondria. That's why we say the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, because the mitochondria creates ATP. This is what ATP looks like. We have the phosphate groups over here. We have a ribose and an adenine. It's just adenine triphosphate, adenosine triphosphate. So what does it consist of? It consists of an adenosine, which is adenine and ribose, these two subunits here, and then 3 phosphate groups, triphosphate, 3 phosphates. Now you can take a phosphate off, and that would make this compound called ADP. So ATP is a fully charged battery and contains the stored energy. So it has these 3 bonds here to connect these phosphates. And in this final bond of the ATP, there is a lot of energy stored, which is from typically glucose, and they store it in between this bond here. Now, when you break this bond, it releases that energy so that the energy can be used in our cells for cellular processes. And so ADP is the inactive form that is not storing the active energy, while ATP has that bond there that's storing the energy, waiting to be broken to be released and used. So you can think of ADP as a battery that's not fully charged. It's just partially charged. It's waiting for that last phosphate in order to be fully charged to be used. While ATP is fully charged, it has that last phosphate on there. It's waiting to be broken, and that final bond, if broken, will release the energy so the cell can use it. ADP is adenosine diphosphate. Di meaning 2, tri meaning 3. So diphosphate, the only difference is there's 2 phosphate groups instead of 3 phosphate groups in the ATP with 3 phosphates. That is the only difference between these two molecules. It is recycled when you create ATP. So when you end up using that bond, using that energy, it creates ADP, and then your mitochondria then will use glucose to put that bond back on and create ATP. All of the energy is stored in the bonds of the compound. Breaking it is going to release the energy. When the cell has energy available, it can store the energy by adding the phosphate group back to the ADP, producing that ATP. And so it is recycled here. ATP, when it's used for energy, it creates ADP because that phosphate has been broken off. Then later, an ADP can have a phosphate moved back on to create ATP. Now, we're going to switch over into photosynthesis, which is the process where plants capture energy from the sun to build glucose through chemical pathways. So we're not talking about ATP right now. We know that ATP is the chemical molecule used in our cells, but we're going to switch over to what plants use to create their food, because before plants can create their energy molecules, they have to first create their own food with those autotrophs. So the plant is going to create glucose from that solar or radiant energy. That glucose is the simple sugar that is the plant's stored food, but that glucose is really too big for the plant to use as active energy, so they're actually going to use that glucose later in cellular respiration. Radiant energy or sunlight is necessary for photosynthesis to occur. If you do not have sunlight, you will not see photosynthesis occurring in those plants. And so that's why you always need to have that sunlight available for photosynthesis. This is the equation that represents photosynthesis. So you have 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules, which create, with the presence of radiant energy, 1 glucose molecule, which is C6H12O6, and 6 oxygen molecules. So here's the equation once again. Carbon dioxide and water go into the plant, sunlight is added, and then the plant is able to create glucose and oxygen. So where does this happen? Photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplasts. The thylakoid membranes within these chloroplasts have a pigment called chlorophyll. And this pigment is what absorbs that light energy from the sun. And so that's the only way that those chloroplasts are able to take in that radiant energy to then use it to convert it into chemical energy. So chlorophyll is a light-absorbing pigment that absorbs the radiant energy from the sun, and it's the reason why our plants have that green pigment and why the chloroplast has the green pigment, because that is what absorbs that radiant energy at the best rate. So who does photosynthesis? We talked a little bit about the autotrophs earlier, plants, some photosynthetic bacteria like cyanobacteria, and diatoms. They also can go through photosynthesis. Now, what can affect photosynthesis? What are things that can affect the process? What are things that are going to prevent photosynthesis from occurring? First, if there's not enough water, photosynthesis can't occur. Because water is a reactant in that process, you need water in order for the equation to happen. So without water, you're not going to be able to push this equation to create glucose. So water is necessary. The rate of photosynthesis increases as the intensity of light increases. So if there's a higher intensity of light, there's going to be more photosynthesis happening. As you can see down here, the rate of photosynthesis is increasing as the light intensity is increasing. But then it comes a point to where it levels off, because that's the maximum light needed to do maximum photosynthesis. The last thing that can affect the rate of photosynthesis is the temperature. As the temperature increases, the rate of photosynthesis increases. As you can see here, temperature is down here at the bottom, rate of photosynthesis is on the side. So as you increase the temperature, the rate of photosynthesis increases, and then once you hit about 35 degrees Celsius, then it drops back down because you're starting to get a little too hot for that photosynthesis to occur. So today you've learned about ATP, you've learned about what energy is, what chemical energy is, how organisms get their energy. You've learned about photosynthesis, what they need in photosynthesis, what it creates, and how the plant is able to transform that energy from radiant energy to that chemical glucose energy.